6 years ago, children began to vanish from Chicago's forgotten neighborhoods. Police dismissed them as runaways, but one retired detective refused to let their ghosts fade into silence. His relentless, heartbreaking obsession uncovered a hidden criminal machine so vast and efficient it shocked the nation and led to the largest child rescue operation in the city's history. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe if you love stories that reveal the truth hiding in the shadows. Chicago, 2015. The city's skyline glittered like a promise, but in its forgotten neighborhoods, children were quietly vanishing, their disappearances dismissed as little more than runaways. For 6 long years, one man, a disgraced and retired detective, waged a lonely battle against an indifferent system, unaware that his relentless pursuit would eventually uncover a hidden predator's web and spark the largest rescue operation in the city's history. Before we dive in, thank you for being here. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your presence turns this story into something we share together. Now let me take you back to where it began. That autumn, Detective Frank Dorsey was a man weighed down by ghosts. After 3 decades in the Chicago Police Department, most of them spent knee-deep in violent crime investigations. He carried the faces of the victims he couldn't save like invisible scars. Their names sat buried in cold case files, gathering dust in precinct archives. But one ghost was different, closer, more painful. It was the memory of his niece, a bright-eyed girl who had vanished a decade earlier, leaving behind a wound that never healed. This loss sharpened Frank's instincts and gave him a painful empathy for the forgotten and overlooked, making him unusually attuned to patterns others brushed aside. At first, it was only a whisper on the city's crime maps, a cluster of missing children reports gathering around the same few working-class neighborhoods on the south and west sides. These communities, shaped by years of economic neglect, often endured their tragedies quietly, where a child's disappearance could be written off as a sad but ordinary fact of life. To the department, the cases were routine: single-parent homes, kids with minor school troubles, a hastily scribbled note left behind. They were labeled runaways, cases that stretched resources thin and rarely invited follow-up. But Frank saw something no one else wanted to see. He noticed the children were getting younger. He noticed many of them had no real history of running away, no trail of rebellious behavior. They were kids who played on the same cracked basketball courts, attended the same underfunded schools, and disappeared along the same ordinary street corners. Connecting the dots became an obsession. Long after his colleagues clocked out, Frank stayed in the precinct, spreading cheap manila folders across his desk, his calloused hands piecing together fragments like a puzzle only he believed existed. In his gut, Frank knew this was no coincidence. It felt like the shadow of a predator moving quietly through blind spots in the city, harvesting its most vulnerable. And Frank was not a man given to flashy gestures. He believed in the grinding, methodical work of building a case. With painstaking care, he gathered a file. 7 names, 7 children, all gone within the same 6-month window, all from within 3 square miles. When he presented his findings to Captain Miller, the contrast was stark. Miller's office was polished, bright, a world apart from the grit of the squad room. Frank laid his evidence on the desk, his voice calm, steady, almost reverent. He pointed to the map dotted with red pins, outlining the chilling similarities. 7 kids, Captain, he said quietly. All from the same area, all written off as runaways. Doesn't that strike you as strange? But Captain Miller leaned back in his leather chair, a practiced look of patience crossing his face. To him, this was familiar. A seasoned cop nearing retirement, projecting personal pain into professional work. Frank's niece was the ghost in the room, and Miller, more politician than cop, thought he recognized the signs. "Frank, I appreciate you bringing this to me," he began, his tone dripping with a polite dismissal. Captain Miller's voice was smooth, rehearsed, a polished instrument of dismissal cloaked in sympathy. "Frank, I know where this is coming from. I know your family's history, but you have to face the facts. There's no evidence of foul play here. No witnesses, no ransom notes. We even have goodbyes from 2 of the kids. These are tragic, yes, but they're domestic problems, not the work of some phantom kidnapper." Frank's jaw tightened, frustration simmering beneath his calm tone. "With respect, Captain, those notes could have been forced. And the other 5 kids, no notes, no history of running, they just vanished. These are good kids, from struggling but decent families. They didn't just walk away. Someone is taking them." Miller let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind meant to end arguments rather than engage them. "So, what do you expect me to do? Launch a citywide task force on your gut feeling? We don't have the manpower, we don't have the budget. My hands are tied." Rising from his chair, he placed a patronizing hand on Frank's shoulder, the gesture more dismissal than comfort. "You're a good cop, one of the best, but you're too close to this. Go home. Enjoy your last year in peace. Don't go chasing ghosts." The words stung like salt on an old wound. As Frank walked out of that sunlit office, the squad room he had called home for 3 decades felt suddenly foreign, almost hostile. His instincts had been reduced to the ramblings of a man haunted by grief. He had seen the pattern, he had seen the truth, and the system he had given his life to had just told him, kindly but firmly, to sit down and stay quiet. For most cops, retirement was a soft landing, fishing trips, grandkids, and the slow surrender of memory. But for Frank Dorsey, retirement was not an ending. It was a declaration of war. The day after he was handed his pension check and gold watch, Frank did not board a flight to Florida. He went to the basement of his modest brick bungalow, a space that smelled of sawdust and oil, once cluttered with forgotten tools and half-finished projects. Over the following weeks, that basement transformed into something else entirely. A precinct of 1, a cold case command center, a war room. He cleared the benches, packed away old hobbies, and erected 2 massive cork boards against the concrete walls. A street-level map of Chicago went up, its grid marked by the neighborhoods that had been quietly bleeding children away. Then came the files. In quiet defiance of department policy, Frank had copied every missing child report that fit the pattern. Dozens of names, dozens of faces, children who had slipped into the cracks. Each face went on the board, pinned carefully beside the stark details of their last known moments. He strung them together, red for geography, blue for victim profiles, yellow for circumstances, until the walls bloomed into a web of connections, a chilling tapestry only he could interpret. Frank's days became disciplined rituals. Up before dawn, a steaming mug of bitter black coffee in hand, he descended the wooden steps into his underground sanctuary. The internet, once distrusted, became his lifeline. He scoured online forums, combed through community papers, and trawled obscure archives for reports that never made it into official databases. And when the afternoon came, he left the glow of his basement screens for the streets, walking the neighborhoods the city had abandoned, searching for whispers, patterns, and the faintest trail of a predator the world refused to acknowledge. Frank became a phantom in his own city, piloting his battered, unmarked sedan through the neighborhoods where children had disappeared, He would sit for hours in the shadows, watching, absorbing the subtle rhythms of streets most officers never lingered on, searching for anything that felt off, some tiny detail the official investigations had overlooked. He was no longer a cop. He was a watcher, a patient hunter whose loneliness was carved into the lines of his face. His basement, to outsiders, might have looked like madness, but to Frank, it was something far more sacred, a memorial, an investigation, and above all, a promise to the smiling faces staring back at him from the corkboard. A promise that he would not forget them. A promise that he would find the ghost who had stolen them. Yet the fortress he built below his brick bungalow was as much a prison as it was a sanctuary. It held the memories of lost children, but it also pushed away the living. The first casualty of Frank's war was his marriage. Angela, his wife of 3 decades, had weathered the storms of being a cop's wife with remarkable strength. She had endured the missed holidays, the sleepless nights, the ever-present fear of the call that might never come. She had been his anchor, the one who tethered him to a normal life. But now, the ghosts he once left at the precinct had followed him home. They stared at her from basement walls, filling their house with a grief that never slept. Angela would lie awake at night, hearing the low sound of Frank pacing, his voice murmuring as though he were speaking to the children themselves. The basement, once filled with harmless projects and the scent of cut wood, had become a tomb. One evening, her voice trembled as she pleaded, "Frank, you have to stop this. You're retired. This isn't your job anymore. It's eating you alive." He looked at her with distant eyes, as though his vision extended far beyond the room. "Someone has to do it, Angie. No one else is looking for these kids. No one else cares." Her heart cracked as she whispered, "But what about us? You're here, but you're not here. You're living down there with them." The canyon between them widened, carved by grief and silence. To Angela, he was drowning in the unresolved pain of his niece's disappearance, dragging her into a sea she could not survive. To Frank, the world was blind, and he alone could still see. Eventually, Angela broke. Not in anger, but in sorrow. With tears staining her cheeks, she packed a bag and left quietly for her sister's house, knowing the separation was not temporary. It was survival. His friends on the force drifted away too. At first, they called, trying to hold on to camaraderie with awkward jokes and forced cheer. But Frank had nothing to offer except the case, the names, the patterns, the endless theories. Conversations collapsed under the weight of his obsession, and the calls stopped. At the precinct, he became a cautionary tale. The younger officers whispered about the once great detective who had gone too far, who had lost himself to ghosts. He knew they pitied him, thought him broken, but he didn't care. Their dismissal only hardened the fire inside him. Frank was alone, without his wife, without his friends, without his reputation. But he still had his mission, and in the austere silence of his basement, that was enough. Because while Frank Dorsey was becoming a ghost in his own life, another ghost was moving through the streets of Chicago, unseen and unsuspected. His name was Walter Bishop, and he was proof that evil could hide behind the most ordinary face. Walter Bishop was the kind of man who could vanish in plain sight. In his 50s, with a soft, unremarkable face and a slow, shuffling walk, he looked like any other blue-collar worker, blending into the city's endless machinery. His job was with Midwest Logistics, driving a plain white cargo van through Chicago's arteries, delivering office paper, school supplies, and sterile medical kits. Thousands of vans just like his crawled the city streets every day. So ordinary, they became invisible. To his co-workers, he was just Walt, quiet, punctual, the guy who ate lunch alone in his van. To his neighbors in the modest bungalow he rented in a working-class suburb, He was the polite man who kept his lawn trimmed and never had visitors. His anonymity wasn't a flaw. It was his greatest asset, a mask he had spent years perfecting. Midwest Logistics was a real company on paper, but beneath the surface, it was a front for something monstrous, a tightly run human trafficking network. And Walter wasn't hauling paper or bleach, he was transporting children. He was a cog in a vast, terrifying machine that preyed almost exclusively on marginalized families, the very communities Frank Dorsey had mapped out in his basement. The traffickers understood the cruel mathematics of indifference. The disappearance of a poor minority child was far less likely to spark media outrage or sustained police action than the loss of a child from a wealthy suburb. They exploited this blind spot with cold, brutal efficiency. Walter's role was horrifyingly simple. A handler would call him with a time and an address. He would roll up in his van to a back alley or a deserted street. A lower-level operative would hand off the package, a child, often drugged into docile silence, and load them into the hidden soundproof compartment in the back. From there, Walter would ferry them to a safe house in some forgettable suburb or to a warehouse buried in the city's decaying industrial sprawl. He was like a modern-day Karen, ferrying souls across a river of concrete and steel, carrying them from the world of the living into a living nightmare. What made him most dangerous wasn't just his van or his cover job. It was his emptiness. Walter felt nothing. No pity. No flicker of guilt. To him, the children weren't children at all. They were packages, inventory, cargo to be shuffled from point A to point B. He had hollowed himself out so completely that he had become invisible not only to the world, but to his own conscience. For years, the pattern of disappearances had been for Frank Dorsey a grim intellectual puzzle, a wall of photos and strings, an obsession that cost him his marriage. But in the spring of 2020, the pattern came crashing into his life with devastating clarity. His grandniece, Isabella, only 12 years old, disappeared while walking home from a friend's house one quiet Tuesday afternoon. Isabella wasn't just another name to Frank. She was a spark of joy, funny and bright, the living legacy of the niece he had lost years ago. He loved her with a fierce, protective devotion. For Maria, Isabella's a mother. Frank's wall of names had always been a source of resentment, a constant reminder of the sister she lost as a child and the wound her uncle refused to let heal. But now, with Isabella gone, that wall became something else entirely, a prophecy fulfilled, a nightmare made real. The 6-block walk that should have carried Isabella safely home instead ended in a void. When Maria's panicked call came, Frank nearly collapsed under the weight of it. The wall of names in his basement, once an abstract puzzle, now bore the face of a girl he adored. At Maria's cramped apartment, the scene was a blur of uniforms and hollow questions, questions that stung with bitter irony. Was she troubled? Did she run away? Maria's tear-streaked face, once skeptical of Frank's obsession, now turned to him with raw desperation. Frank, you have to find her. All that work in your basement, you're the only one who knows what's happening. Please bring her back. In that moment, his obsession became his mission, his vow. He promised he would not rest, not eat, not sleep until Isabella was home. From that night forward, Frank was no longer a ghost watching the city. He was a hunter, pursuing the predator who had stolen a piece of his own soul. His grief, once a steady ember, ignited into a roaring fire that consumed every breath. Fueled by bitter coffee and sheer adrenaline, he retraced Isabella's steps, again and again, his trained eyes combing the sidewalks and alleys for any detail the official investigation overlooked. His advantage was clear. He wasn't bound by police procedure anymore. He could slip into places the cops couldn't, ask questions in ways they wouldn't, and dig without waiting for warrants or bureaucracy to catch up. He turned to the neighborhood itself. Wealth had never reached these streets, but small businesses had their own defenses. Dusty cameras watching over laundromats, corner stores, and bakeries. Frank became a familiar figure, the polite but haunted man who walked in with a photo of his grandniece, asking softly if he could see their tapes. Moved by his quiet desperation, most agreed. For days he sat hunched in cramped back rooms, eyes fixed on grainy monitors, fast-forwarding through endless hours of static, pixelated streets and uneventful afternoons. On the fourth day, buried in the blurred footage of a family-owned bakery, the needle in his haystack appeared. For only 3 seconds, at the precise time Isabella should have passed, a plain, white, windowless cargo van idled at the curb. The logo was bland, forgettable. Midwest Logistics, printed inside a simple blue circle. To most, it would look like nothing more than a delivery. But Frank's instincts flared. He snapped a still frame with his phone and carried it like evidence of a ghost finally materializing. Hours later, scanning tapes from a corner store 3 blocks away, he found it again. 10 minutes earlier, the same van, the same emptiness, slipping through the city like a shadow. When Frank saw the same white van appear on another tape, a cold electric jolt ran through him, the primal rush of a hunter realizing he was finally closing in. This wasn't coincidence anymore. It was a pattern, clear and undeniable. For 2 days, he built a meticulous timeline, charting the van's slow crawl through the neighborhood. Its route was aimless on the surface, but it overlapped perfectly with Isabella's walk home. Frank had it. The first tangible link, a vehicle, a company name. For the first time in 6 years, the ghost had weight and shape, and the certainty both thrilled and terrified him. Armed with his breakthrough, Frank returned to the place he had sworn never to go again, his old precinct. Walking into the squad room felt like stepping back into a world that no longer recognized him. To the younger cops, he was a relic, a ghost of a detective whose mind had been warped by grief. When he finally sat across from a young detective, ambition flickering in the man's eyes, Frank laid out everything. The grainy still frames, the hand-drawn maps, the chilling timeline. "This is it," he said firmly. "Midwest Logistics. You tail this van, and you'll find Isabella, and every other kid." The detective skimmed the photos with the same detached sympathy Captain Miller had once worn. "Mr. Dorsey, we ran the plates. Midwest Logistics is legitimate. They have over 100 vans in this city. Their presence isn't suspicious, it's routine." Frank's voice cracked with fury. "It's not routine. I tracked it. It was following her route." But the detective's tone hardened. "You're too close. We can't launch an operation based on blurry photos of a delivery van. I have actual leads to chase. Good day, sir." The rejection was absolute. Walking out onto the steps of the precinct, Frank felt the bitterness of déjà vu, the same bureaucratic indifference that had let countless children vanish. He had handed them the key, and they had turned away. The city sprawled before him like a cold, unfeeling labyrinth, and he realized the truth. If Isabella was going to be saved, he would have to save her himself. The hunt that had already cost him so much was about to turn lethal. What Frank could not know was that he was not the only hunter on the trail. Hundreds of miles away, in a sterile FBI office in Washington, D.C., Special Agent Sarah Martinez studied her own map. Unlike Frank's corkboard, hers spanned the entire nation, crisscrossed with chilling data points. A brilliant analyst with the Bureau's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, she was tracking the same network, an organized, multi-state machine that thrived on moving children like contraband. Where Frank relied on instinct and grit, Martinez wielded algorithms, databases, and patterns invisible to the naked eye. Their paths, forged by grief and data alike, were about to converge on the same ghost. The network agent Sarah Martinez hunted was unlike anything she had studied before. It wasn't sloppy or chaotic. It was run with the precision of a corporation, a ghostly enterprise that left behind almost no physical trace. Her work was a painstaking excavation of silence. Phone records combed across multiple states, obscure financial transfers traced to hollow shell companies, transportation logs scrutinized for anomalies. For months, she waded through dead ends. But then a faint signal began to emerge. Small, seemingly unrelated transactions converging on a single point. Chicago. The data suggested that the city was more than a stop along their routes. It was a hub, a central clearinghouse for children who would vanish into the machinery of the network. When she dug into Chicago's official records, Sarah found herself staring at the same wall of indifference Frank had beaten against for years. Dozens of missing children cases, all written off as runaways, all clustered in the same neighborhoods. Through the cold lens of statistics, she saw what Frank had seen with his heart. The numbers didn't lie. A pattern that could not be coincidence pulsed beneath the city's surface. And as she read the old reports, one name kept appearing: Detective Frank Dorsey. His handwriting filled the margins with notes urging a broader investigation, his voice straining against bureaucracy that refused to listen. Intrigued, Sarah pulled his record. 30 years on the force, a spotless file, a man who had carried his own family tragedy inside the job. Not a crank, not a bitter retiree chasing shadows, but a professional who had seen the truth years before her algorithms ever flagged it. Her work had given her the what, a network operating in Chicago, but she was missing the who and the where. She suspected that Frank, the so-called crazy ex-cop with the wall of names, might hold the missing pieces. On instinct, she did something data rarely asked of her. She booked a flight to Chicago. Two hunters driven by different weapons, his intuition, her data, were about to collide. Meanwhile, the network itself thrived by hiding in plain sight. Their brilliance was in normalcy. They didn't lurk in shadows. They lived in daylight, disguised in the routines of the city. Abductions were outsourced to local, low-level criminals who were paid in cash and kept blind to the larger machine. Once taken, children were stashed in suburban safe houses, rented homes indistinguishable from their neighbors, with minivans in the driveway and bikes leaning on porches. But inside, the houses were prisons, soundproof rooms where the young victims were sedated, identities erased, spirits broken. Then came Walter Bishop. The quiet man with the white van wasn't a delivery driver. He was the transporter, the artery connecting suburb to city. His task was to move the children from these seemingly harmless homes to the network's true heart. Vast, windowless warehouses buried inside Chicago's decaying industrial parks. From the outside, they blended in with the rust and concrete, one more forgotten building in a sea of commerce. Inside, they were something else entirely. Cavernous halls lined with shipping crates, each one a coffin-like cell in the cold industrial rhythm of a machine built to devour innocence. Most of the crates stacked inside those cavernous warehouses carried what their labels promised: cheap electronics, textiles, machine parts. But others were something else entirely. Modified with vents and soundproofing, they were cages disguised as cargo, prisons hidden in plain sight. The entire operation functioned like a grotesque parody of corporate logistics. Children were reduced to inventory. Safe houses became short-term storage units. Warehouses served as distribution centers. And the men at the helm weren't wild-eyed monsters. They were managers, logisticians, accountants of human misery. The horror of the system lay not in its chaos, but in its order. Cold, efficient, and profit-driven, it was evil stripped of passion, leaving only soulless precision. This pipeline of sorrow flowed invisibly beneath the surface of everyday life, a ghostly network almost impossible to fight. Almost. Because it was about to collide with something it had not accounted for, the relentless analog obsession of a heartbroken old man who refused to let go. On a bleak, gray afternoon, that collision began. Special Agent Sarah Martinez pulled her rental car up to Frank Dorsey's modest brick bungalow. She had read the file, prepared herself to meet a broken eccentric or a paranoid crank. But when Frank opened the door before she could knock, she was met by a tall, stooped figure whose lined face carried decades of sorrow. His eyes flicked over her sharp suit and government badge. To him, she wasn't an ally. She was another cog in the machine that had failed him. "You're the Fed," he said, his gravelly voice low and blunt. It wasn't a question. "I'd like to talk to you about the missing children cases you reported," Martinez replied evenly. "May I come in?" Frank didn't answer. He simply turned and walked deeper into the house, leaving the door open. Instead of the living room, he led her down a narrow flight of wooden stairs. The moment her shoes hit the basement floor, Sarah's carefully constructed assessment unraveled. She was used to clean databases and sterile charts. What she saw instead stopped her cold. The basement was a shrine, a war room, a living archive of obsession. Maps papered the walls, school photos stared back with hopeful eyes, newspaper clippings dangled, and hundreds of colored strings wove a vast web of tragedy and connection. The chaos was breathtaking, and yet beneath it lay a terrifying logic. 6 years of relentless, solitary work etched into every inch. Sarah turned slowly, absorbing it all. Where she had seen faceless data, points, Frank had given them names, faces, and stories. This wasn't madness. This was a kind of sorrowful brilliance, the raw human intuition her algorithms could never replicate. In a hushed voice, awed despite herself, she whispered, "You saw it. All this time, you saw it." Frank, arms folded, watched her with weary suspicion. He had grown used to pity and dismissal, but what he saw in her eyes wasn't condescension. It was respect. His voice softened. "I saw it, but no one would listen." Sarah met his gaze, her tone steady. "I'm listening now." And in that dim, dusty basement, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten children, an unlikely alliance was forged. Frank began to walk her through his investigation, detail by painstaking detail, the fire in his lonely crusade finally meeting the steel of federal authority. Most of the crates were filled with exactly what their labels promised: cheap electronics, textiles, machine parts. But some crates had been surgically altered, ventilated, soundproofed, turned into moving cages. The whole operation read like a grotesque corporate supply chain where children were treated as inventory, safe houses as short-term storage, and warehouses as regional distribution centers. The men running it were not frenzied monsters, but managers, logisticians, accountants of misery, and the horror was in their chilling, profit-driven efficiency rather than any dramatic frenzy. It was a modern, nearly unbeatable pipeline of sorrow, an invisible current under everyday life, until it met something it had not accounted for: the stubborn, analog obsession of one grieving old man, unwilling to look away. On a bleak afternoon, Special Agent Sarah Martinez drove up to Frank Dorsey's modest bungalow expecting the eccentric or the deluded, but when he opened the door, she found a stooped veteran whose basement was less a sign of madness and more a shrine. Floor-to-ceiling maps, school photos, newspaper clippings, and hundreds of colored strings that wove a brutal, obsessively logical narrative of 6 years of single-minded work. Where her databases had shown cold data points, Frank had given names, faces, and context. When he produced the blurry stills of a plain white Midwest logistics van, the moment was electric. Her national data-driven investigation had been handed a logo, a tangible, huntable target. And in that dusty, grief-filled room, the two lonely hunters formed an alliance. Frank's shoe-leather knowledge of neighborhoods and timing fused with Martinez's high-tech tools, and in hours what had taken him years began to coalesce. She secured a warrant for the 100-vehicle fleet and placed trackers, producing a live map that, when overlaid with Frank's red pins, exposed an undeniable pattern. Specific vans, driven by a handful of drivers, stitched together the times and places of abductions. Walter Bishop's bland van surfaced again and again, its routes converging on 3 suburban safe houses and 2 anonymous windowless warehouses in the industrial corridor, sites that transformed the investigation from a string of cold files into an urgent, ongoing rescue operation. The discovery changed everything. This was no longer about proving a theory or soothing a grieving man's need to be right. It was a coordinated, high-stakes plan to hit multiple locations at once, to rescue children and dismantle a soulless machine. And for Frank, after 6 years of being dismissed, it was a sorrowful vindication that turned his private war into a joint campaign with federal power behind it. The alliance had grown in a way Frank never imagined. FBI agents, Chicago police, and himself, the once dismissed crazy ex-cop, now at the heart of the largest rescue operation in the city's modern history. When Agent Martinez presented the combined evidence, the CPD brass had no choice but to listen, and their embarrassment turned quickly into cooperation. Frank's war room was no longer his basement. It had become a sterile, high-tech command post inside the FBI's Chicago field office. His handwritten notes had been digitized, his red pins converted into glowing markers on massive screens. And yet, beneath the layers of technology and bureaucracy, it was still his knowledge, his instincts, his maps, his ghosts, that gave the operation its soul. The tension before the raid was suffocating. 200 officers and agents, armored vehicles, aerial surveillance, all of it humming in careful synchronization. Frank sat in the corner, clutching a cold cup of coffee, watching the storm gather. For 6 years, he had fought alone. Now the weight of an army had descended on his ghosts. His thoughts, however, weren't on the logistics, but on Isabella, on the promise he had made to her mother, that he would bring her home. At precisely 4 in the morning, the strike began. 5 teams moved like a single organism, hitting 3 suburban safe houses and 2 massive warehouses at the same instant. In the command post, Frank and Martinez stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on a wall of monitors. The radio feeds crackled to life, calm voices reporting with military precision. Team Alpha, we've breached. Multiple suspects in custody, 6 children alive. Relief rippled through the room, and more reports followed. Terrified, malnourished, but breathing children pulled from hidden basements and locked rooms. Then came the warehouse raids, the true test. At the first sight, SWAT shattered a steel door and stormed inside. Guards were subdued without a fight, but it was what lay beyond that silenced even the toughest veterans. Rows of crates stacked like merchandise. One section bore the chilling modifications Frank knew too well. Ventilated, reinforced, cages disguised as cargo. As they pried the crates open, dozens of children stared out, wide-eyed, paralyzed by terror so raw it struck the seasoned officers like a physical blow. And still, the second warehouse, the one they believed held the majority of the captives, remained dark, unknown, and waiting. Walter Bishop was on shift that night, and Frank knew in his bones that this warehouse was the one, that Isabella was inside. The raid unfolded in chaos. Unlike the others, this time armed resistance met the team. Gunfire cracked through the dark, echoing in the cavernous space. When the shooting stopped, two of the network's enforcers lay dead, and the tactical unit pushed deeper into the maze of crates and steel. At the back of the building, a section of wall caught their eyes. Too new, the cinder blocks a different shade. Remembering details from Frank's notes, the team leader ordered it breached. Sledgehammers rang out, and behind the false wall a soundproofed chamber emerged, filled with filthy mattresses and a dozen terrified children. Over the radio, the commander read the names from cruel laminated tags hung around their necks. Then came the one name that shattered the tension. "We have an Isabella Soto. Repeat, we have Isabella Soto, alive and safe." In the command post, Frank Dorsey, the man who hadn't shed a tear in 30 years, collapsed into a chair, his body shaking as a raw, beautiful sound of long-suppressed relief tore free. Isabella was alive. The doors had come down, the children were safe, and his most personal ghost had returned. As dawn broke, Chicago awoke to a miracle. The raids had pulled dozens of children from hidden prisons, and the story spread across the city like fire. At a local community center turned into a sanctuary, reunions unfolded in scenes too powerful for words. Parents who had lived in grief for months or years embraced their children with laughter and sobs, clinging to them as if they might disappear again. Frank was there, but not in the spotlight. He stood quietly in the back, leaning against a wall, watching as Maria, once broken, hysterical, now fused herself to Isabella with an embrace so fierce it seemed to defy the universe. Everywhere he looked, Frank saw life restored to faces that had only existed for him as black and white photos pinned to his basement wall. Now they were flesh and blood, vibrant, trembling with joy. Agent Martinez joined him, her usual professionalism softened, a coffee cup in hand. "You did this, Frank," she murmured. "All of this. Because of you." He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the families. "They did it," he whispered. "They just needed someone to listen." He didn't stay for the reporters. He didn't take the credit. Frank Dorsey was never the hero in his own story, only a stubborn man who refused to stop listening to the ghosts. And in that moment, surrounded by children who were no longer lost, he finally knew it had all been worth it. Frank left the celebration quietly, slipping out a side door in his worn coat, just another anonymous figure disappearing into the morning streets. When he reached home, he descended the familiar steps into his basement, his sanctuary, his prison, his war room. For a long time he stood in silence, staring at the wall that had consumed 6 years of his life. The faces of lost children, the tangle of colored strings, the maps that had charted sorrow like a cartography of ghosts. Then, slowly, with hands both trembling and steady, he began to take them down. One by one, the photos came off the board. Isabella's bright face, the other children rescued in the raids, each carefully set aside. The maps, the strings, the painstaking evidence of his lonely war. Gone. The battle was over. The ghosts, at least these ghosts, were finally at peace. But when the wall was bare, one board remained. On it, the smiling photo of his niece, the first ghost, the one who had set him on this path. He gazed at her face, knowing the fight was not truly finished. There would always be others, always children who vanished into the cracks. His war could never completely end. Yet for this one day, this miraculous day, he allowed himself to feel the weight lift. He had won. He had kept his promise. He was a scarred warrior who had stared into the heart of darkness and, against all odds, carried back the light. In the end, Frank Dorsey was never the hero of his own story. He was simply a man who refused to stop listening to the ghosts. His lonely war brought dozens of children home and restored hope to families who had almost forgotten how to dream. And though his scars would never fade, his relentless devotion proved that even in the darkest corners, light can be found. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next hidden story waiting to be told.